So here we are. Today we're going to talk about the historical insights and tidbits of my book, Murder at Hartigan House. I'm Lee Strauss. This is my husband, Norm, and this is the Strauss Cafe podcast. So welcome. So,
I'd like to explain why I'm wearing this Mexican shirt.
okay.
Usually at this time of the year we would be in Mexico, or many times for 5 years we were snowbirds. This is way off the topic, but I'm going to go here anyways because I know people are asking, why is no one wearing a Mexican? This is a Mexican dress shirt I bought to remind myself that I'm usually in Mexico at this time.
Yes, we live in Canada. It gets cold in Canada. We fortunately live in a temperate part. I don't know if you knew there was a temperate part of Canada that doesn't get the big freeze every year or tons of snow. And that's in a part that's in the southern west corner of British Columbia. So we're in the Okanagan Valley. This temperate part also includes the lower mainland of Vancouver and Victoria on Vancouver Island, that area. So if you can't leave Canada in the winter, a lot of people come this way to spend their winters. But we enjoy Mexican culture and the sunshine and palm trees and tropical fruit and walks on the ocean. That's kind of how we like to relax. And so that's sort of what we choose to do when we can. This year's an off year, but we're hoping to get back into it next year. So let us know if you're snowbirders, and or if you're just wondering what the heck we're talking about and you're just ready for us to get into the topic of London in transition 5 years after World War I.
Yeah.
That is where Murder at Hartigan House takes place. It's the spring of 1923. What was life like in London at that time in terms of the social change and the practical experiences of people who had lived through World War I and were now recuperating? And even though it was 5 years, it was a slow process of it was changed. They could never go back to the way it was. And overall, there was this blanket of just fatigue. It wasn't like in World War II where it was bombed, but a lot of soldiers came back with shell shock and stuff, or they were just incapacitated. And there were many, many deaths due to the war and due to the pandemic, the influenza that followed after it, which left in Ginger's world a lot of widows.
Yeah, and a lot of the women back then and the widows, lots of widows, they had during the war worked. And so after the war, they were not content to go back to their kind of social and working climate before the war. In other words, you kind of let them out of their cage, so to speak, and they did not want to go back.
Yes, it's similar to, because World War II is a more common and well-known event, but World War I is similar. Women needed to get into jobs that were typically reserved for men, and they made money, and they had an experience of a certain type of freedom that they didn't have before, a certain place in society that they weren't allowed to enter. And so when the war ended, there was, an expectation by those in power that women would retreat back into what they were. But of course, we got women cutting their hair, tossing their corsets, raising their hemlines, and saying, I'm going to wear makeup, and that doesn't make me a prostitute. And so there was a bit of a reaction or rebellion against that. But the liberties for women were really hard fought, and there wasn't a lot yet that they had accomplished. It was more like a hope of being able to get there.
Yeah, and so Ginger she was a widow, but she was kind of the wrong kind of widow. She was one who didn't want to. She was smart and she was independent. She was wealthy, and so this was and widows at that time were expected to be very kind of fade into the background and remain in a constant state of mourning
And poverty
and
too.
poverty. So Ginger, especially somebody starting her own business, she started her Lady Gold Investigates office, and
Yeah, and her dress shop.
Yeah.
First. So she decided she'd be a woman in business, which wasn't unheard of, but it wasn't common. If you watch any like old YouTube videos of people walking around back in the day, in silent films and stuff in certain cities, most of the population that you see walking around is male. You see the odd female, but it's mostly men, because they were the ones who were in business. They were the ones that were hanging out down in these city centers.
I wonder about Ginger's fashion shop, because at that time in 1923, there was the flappers, of course. And like you were mentioning, fashion was really, at that time, especially the flapper generations and the bright young things. What is a bright young thing? Maybe you should explain that for a second.
Well, I think that was more of a term for the elite, those who were part of the peerage, whatever, who had wealth. They lived lives of leisure.
But bright young thing was a phrase that was used
Yes.
to describe.
It described these people who were coming of age in that class, because they had access to cars, drugs, music. They had money, and so they lived more of a hedonistic lifestyle. They rebelled against the propriety of their parents. There were certain wings, the way that you do things, and you never veered off of that. And so they were the flapper generation and the bright young things. I don't think people who were in like third class that had to work 16 hours a day cared about stuff like that, and they certainly weren't.
I just wonder about Ginger's dress and hat shop, because I guess the point is that the new fashions that were coming in, like you mentioned, shorter hemlines, shorter headlines, shorter hemlines, and the cloche hats and stuff. There were some ways a rebellion against the past, the tradition.
Well, they definitely were. Yeah.
So Ginger's shop was kind of a high-end, we would call it a high-end shop.
Yeah,
would she have included those kinds of fashions, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Her sister-in-law Felicia would have been a bright young thing. She was 10 years younger than Ginger. And in Murder in Hartigan House, this is the first time we meet Ginger's in-laws, Ambrosia, the Lady Dowager Ambrosia, who is very entrenched in the Victorian ways and the way things were done, and it's ruffles her feathers a lot to see these changes, and she doesn't like them and she doesn't want to embrace them. And yet her charge, Felicia, her granddaughter, is on the other extreme. Ginger's more the centrist, but Felicia is on the other extreme of like just living recklessly and trying all the things, and seeing how close she can get to the line without crossing it, or maybe even crossing it. But in terms of fashion at the store, Ginger appealed to both. She appealed to the older school women who came and talked to the seamstress and had something created just for them in that style. That was how things were done before factory dresses came. Women would come to the dress shop. They would talk to the designer. They would work on a design for that particular upper class woman. They would have a model, referred to as a mannequin, model it around, and there would be, money would change hands. So Ginger was still doing that in her dress shop, but upstairs she was like, again, ahead of her time. She was like factory dresses where a certain style, flapper style, could be made in any size, and a woman could come, buy the outfit, and walk out of the shop with it. That was really an unheard of thing prior to the early 20s. So in the books, this, especially the early parts of the Ginger Girl Mystery Series, this is a thing where, like, young people would want to go upstairs to shop, and the older crowd would stay down and do things the old way. So Ginger was a very smart businesswoman.
So what other things around that time would you have noticed in London? If you were to go back in time from present day and you were in London in 1923, what other things would you have, cultural shifts were going on?
Well, there are things like motor cars were starting to replace horse and buggy. I would say in the early 20s, the ratio would still have been more horses and carriages to motor cars, but towards the end of the decade, it reverses. There's more motor cars than horses. Over the course of the decade, and this is true in America too, the roads and highways start to be developed to accommodate the motor cars, and also gas stations or petrol stations were starting to pop out in places where they weren't before.
I read that phone booths were kind of starting to appear. The familiar red kiosks that you see that you saw in London for decades.
Yeah, those are iconic. Yeah,
they were just starting to appear. I know this is because for one of the Lady Gold Investigates book, there was a scene where we had Ginger in one part of town, and she quickly had to phone Basil or something.
Yeah.
And of course, there's no cell phone, so I had her get out of her car, run to the end of the street, and there's a phone booth. And so I had to really. Was there phone booths back then? There were, but they were positioned just a few of them throughout London and outside of hospitals, train stations and stuff. You might see a phone booth.
Right.
Just starting to happen.
Yes, and other things that were coming online were electricity. It was very common still to have gas lamps and oil lamps in the early 20s, but as the decade went on, you saw more fixtures being converted to electricity. And I was just reading one book where the author who was writing this at the time talked about the awkward wiring in the chandelier to convert it to electricity. So there was probably a lot of that kind of visual thing of electrical wires running around the ceilings and stuff to convert lamps and chandeliers to electricity. Yeah, and I think just overall, that is in a nutshell what London was like 5 years after the war. I liked also a lot of times just to say, well, what was the parallel here in North America? Usually it's the U.S. And in those regards, I think it was very similar in terms of social change, maybe, and probably too in terms of losing a lot of young men.
Politically, it would have been changing too.
Yeah, there were a lot of changes.
They weren't allowed to vote unless you were 30 years old.
Well,
right?
that was in Britain. That was one thing that was different. That is an interesting tidbit, is that the U.S. was ahead when it came to suffrage issues. In 1920, I think it was when the women were legally allowed to vote at 21 or 19. I think it was 21. But in Britain, they were only, in 1923, you had to be 30 years old as a woman in order to vote, plus you had to have some property. You had to qualify in some property situation. So you either had to own property, you had to be leasing property, you had to be married to someone who owned property. And so basically it meant you had to be 30 years old and money. You had to have some money. And that was the law until 1928 in England. Until then, they made it a little bit more even, where women and men could both vote at the age of 21. But in 1923, Ginger would have qualified. She was 30 years old, I think, in 1923, or 31, whereas Felicia would not have qualified because she was only 20. So that was that situation. But I think now we'll move on to our second point, and that is what the world of medicine looked like in 1923. I mean, that was over 100 years ago.
Didn't we, when we were in London one time, and for those of you who've been watching these podcasts, we've mentioned this before. Because we were living in Europe, we would sometimes go to London or to England because it was just a very quick flight from Berlin, and kind of tool around London to try to get a sense of, for the purpose of the writing of the books. Now, didn't we at one point go to the school?
I think we might have driven by it, and we went there at that time. We went to the London Writing Festival.
Yes.
But that was why we were there. But I do think we did do a drive around.
I remember walking, I think.
Or walking?
I'm talking about the London School of Medicine for Women.
I'm not sure if it still is in existence today or if they converted it. We will let you know in the description, and also probably Normal, just when he edits this, will pop up some. When we don't know it, when we're talking, we'll make sure we'll let you know it.
I just have a memory of seeing it, of walking by it and looking at the front door of it, and maybe it was a fever dream or something, but I know we did go out of our way to try to find it.
I can imagine that we did do that.
Yeah.
We've done a lot of things, so it's hard sometimes to remember it all. But, when we were researching, for this podcast, these are things I researched when I was writing this book back in 2017, which is a long time from now. It was like 9 years ago almost. So it's good to refresh our memory and my memory. So I'm going to put my glasses on here. What did I put here? Progress, but 1 foot in the past. That's right. So what was the world of medicine like in 1923? How was it so different from now? Obviously, we have very advanced medical situations here, but back in 1923 it wasn't like that. So do you recall?
Yeah, in particular to this murder mystery at Hartigan House, there are several things sort of to be noted, especially when it comes to forensics. But just generally speaking, this was before antibiotics, so...
Well, that was one thing. There's no penicillin.
Yeah.
So people could die of any type of kind of
minor infections,
whereas nowadays there are a lot of things people would die about that wouldn't really happen nowadays, wouldn't even be heard of.
And in those days, people were very reluctant to go to a hospital for several reasons. They were not trusted like they are today. They were kind of, if you went to a hospital, it meant you were of a lower social standing, because in those days doctors made house calls, but only usually to upper class. So, or unless it was a real emergency. But so if you were seen going to a hospital, if you went to the hospital, it meant you were automatically lower class. The hospitals were often short-staffed and unsanitary to today's standards, and they were just not trusted as much. So well, and I think that always comes back to a certain point where we don't really understand as Canadians, and probably as Americans, just how deeply entrenched the class system was and is in England. We don't really have that. I mean, we have different social classes, middle class, people who live under the poverty line, those who 1% people, whatever. But in terms of what you can be born into, or just the whole lord and lady thing, I will confess that I've probably got a few of those bits wrong in the books as time went on, because it's confusing even just how people are addressed sometimes for persons like me. But so that bled into how people were treated medically. You got doctors would favor you over the ones who weren't of a certain class or didn't have certain money, and plus there just wasn't the medical knowledge. Yeah, and as it pertains particularly to murder investigations now, now so murder happens at Hartigan House. Well, it's a skeleton was.
Yeah, it's a decade-old skeleton was found in the attic of Hartigan House, and that was where Ginger was just arriving from Boston because she was going to inherit this family home, and so she was trying to decide what she wanted to do. And she was greeted by her butler, who immediately took her upstairs to the attic and showed her the skeleton that had been there. That body had been there for 10 years since the house had been shut up.
So they would have, now in your book, I'm not sure if you do this in this way, but they would have called in a doctor to examine the remains.
Yeah, every time there's a death, police are called and a doctor is called to come,
Yeah, so-
even back in those days.
So a forensic specialist, like a pathologist, was very rare back then. So it would have been a doctor. And here's where the medical times, the context kind of comes in, because back in those days, a doctor, even in this case, examining these remains, any opinion of the household, if it was from somebody in the household who was wealthy, the doctor would have given that opinion, even though it was unqualified, a lot of weight. And that's very different, hopefully different than it is today, is one thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and that still follows through, even in the book I'm writing right now, which takes place in 1929, and a murder is occurring in the estate of an earl. And it's the same situation. He feels like he has this authority, and he does in a way, to just brush off the police investigation, because police weren't highly esteemed back then. They, even now they have problems with reputation, but back then it was really, really that way. Police were not trusted.
Yeah. So you would have this scenario where somebody comes or is examining the bones, and Ginger, who's a widow, who's very curious and intelligent,
A wealthy widow.
and wealthy, it would be interesting.
Well, she could have just said, we want to hush this, cover it up, get rid of these bones, don't
It's
say
a
anything,
scandal,
don't do anything.
family scandal.
Yes, and as the investigation went on, it started pointing towards her father maybe was implicated, and also was trying to cover up something, and that's why when he shut the house up and went to Boston, this body was just left in the attic, and so. But because of the type of person Ginger is, she wouldn't let this happen. She wanted to know this body needed to be identified. This person needed to have a decent burial.
And they would have known, they knew from an early part of the investigation, that it was a murder.
Yes.
Because it wasn't, now the body was found, I don't know how much can I give away here, but the body was found in an attic.
Yes, that's known.
And so it wasn't right away. It was not. They knew it was an accidental death. Somebody stashed this body.
Yeah.
It couldn't have happened by accident. So right away there was a murder investigation.
And also they knew it was somebody of importance, social importance, because of how the skeleton was still in clothing. And Ginger, being the fashionista that she is, recognized the dress designer. So they knew that this person wasn't, a former staff member or whatever, it was somebody else. And how did this person of social standing end up in the attic? And obviously this person must be a missing person. So it was an intriguing story, and Ginger wasn't going to just let that lie. And I also think the fact that the body was obviously of a certain class required that an investigation happened. Things that were difficult to establish were cause of death sometimes, unless it was obviously like a knife or a gunshot wound.
I think that they could figure out if it was very obvious somebody got hit in the head, or there was some blunt trauma or stuff like that. But there are other things that were much harder to, like poison, for example, was much harder
Poison
to trace.
is like decades, centuries have been used to knock people off you didn't like, and there was really no way to prove that for many years. And at this time it was difficult too, because forensics was in its very, very infancy. Even though someone might have claimed to be a forensic specialist at the time, they were a specialist to a very limited degree because there was just so much yet that was unknown. I think fingerprinting was something that I know it was, being used then at that time, so that was there. Only really intelligent, thoughtful people would consider blood splatter, but I don't think it wasn't yet an official forensic tool to examine blood splatter.
Meaning the direction of the blood on a wall or on the floor.
But somebody who had a scientific mind would notice that.
Yeah.
But that changed a lot in one decade, because when I was writing Higgins and Hawks, which is Haley's spin-off, takes place in the 30s, they knew a lot more about forensic science, even though it was still also in a youthful spot. But in the early 20s, it was really quite brand new. The idea of using forensics to solve crimes. So let's move on to the London Medical School for Women. Let's talk about women in medicine in the early 20s. So the London Medical School for Women was established in 1874. So it was around for a while before Haley was a student there, right?
That surprised me. I didn't realize that school had been in existence that long.
Yeah, it was surprising too. I mean, because I understood that there were doctors. I watched Dr. Quinn. I mean, there have been female doctors for a long time, but they are rare, and they have to fight hard with the establishment to get what they want, and if they want a career or a field in medicine. And so this school was really pioneering, and what we learned when we were sort of researching about it was one of the first, or the first, woman physician who was licensed in Europe or in England in 1865 was called Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. And so she was a co-founder of this school, the Medical School for Women in London, and did a tremendous amount of work in just pushing through the barriers and the ceilings to allow women to enter the field of medicine. Even though, when they had to go through and qualify for all of the things just as rigorously as men, they still were limited in the ways that they were able to practice.
And they were often pushed to this kind of, other kind of disciplines.
Mm-hmm. That's what the limitations, yeah.
Yeah, they were in women's health and children's health and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, obviously that's a good piece. Women deserve to have medical care as well, and children, and good medical care. But it was the fact that it was looked at like caring for women and children was a subpar practice. That was the perception. So real physicians, were allowed to be surgeons and treat men and all of that as well. You could only do that if you were a nurse. You could tend to men, but as a doctor, you weren't allowed to do that. And so there were still certain restrictions that women faced, and basically they just had to work twice as hard for the same amount of recognition. And you have something to add to that?
Well, I just this Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, that was her name, right? She seems to be pretty fascinating figure. When I just started diving into her background a little bit, I thought, wow, this would be a woman that Ginger would have loved to have met.
Yes, too bad I didn't get her to meet her. That would have been because I do often bring in real life characters.
She not only was a co-founder of that school, the London School for Medicine for Women, but she also was the first mayor.
Woman mayor.
The first woman mayor in England. And she, in 1908, I think it was, she became the mayor of the town she was born in.
Yes.
In Suffolk. I can't remember the name of the town, starts with an A, but that's interesting. So she was a reformer, a real firebrand.
She was a real force of nature, and of course she was a big piece of the suffragette movement in England too. She was forefront. Women in medicine just faced a lot of open hostility, and they had to bite their tongue a lot, because if they really said what they thought, the doors would close in their face. I also had to research why, Haley Higgins, who's American and from Boston, would go to London to study medicine. I had her traveling with Ginger on the SS Rosa, and the reason that they traveled together was because this is what Haley was doing. She was going to go to the school. And then I created a situation where the dorms were full so that she would have to live with Haley at Hartigan House. So those are little plot things I did. But there had to be a legitimate reason for her to do this, and there was one, and that was that this medical school for women was created by and for women, and there was a certainty that if you qualified, you could get in. Whereas, in Boston, Harvard University wouldn't admit women. They funneled women into, two other sort of what was considered lesser universities at the time, Tufts and Boston University. But even then, it was more of a sense of having to get permission to attend. Even if the men or the powers that be decided they didn't want you to, then you couldn't, just randomly. So that was the situation in 1923, and for the whole medical topic, which is a backdrop to the story of murder at Hartigan House. And so in this series, this is a series that we're talking about different historical components to the books in the Ginger Gold Mystery series, and maybe later on in the spin-off series. So I hope that you enjoyed this, that it just maybe inspired or created some new interests or some trails that you're going to go down now to research for yourself. If you enjoyed this podcast and this YouTube show, please subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and hit the notification button. And also check out the description. We'll be adding links to all the things that we've talked about, including Elizabeth Garrett Anderson and our Patreon community, and the book, of course, Murder at Hartigan House. So thanks again for joining.
Appreciate it. Thanks for joining us on these little walks through history.
Yes, behind the mystery is the history.
Behind the mystery is the history.
Or behind the history is the mystery. Either one will work.
Did you just think of that?
I don't know.